Good afternoon, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here again. There's a lot of things around here. Really, as the professor has mentioned, and I'm going to briefly talk about this big challenge that we have in the Brazilian steel industry, that we have here in Brazil, in Latin America, and also worldwide. We actually have been talking a lot about yesterday and today about the big challenges, but this one is an important, very important challenge. So I'd like to start from the beginning, from the global commitment in the emission of greenhouse gases. And you can see in the red curve and the Paris Agreement how this would go if we didn't do anything. And then in the yellow curve, with all the definitions, all the projects that we are, and the green one is the Paris Agreement, that would be to reduce up to 50% in 2030 and reach to carbon neutral in 2050. The goal is that the temperature will globally will increase in 1.5 degrees up to 2100. Then, therefore, there are many agreements in the Paris Agreement that are reviewed every 5 years. And what's happening is that the world is not following it. The developed countries said they were going to invest $100 billion a year from 2005, and so far of 100 billion a year, they have invested 80 billion ever since this was defined. So the way it is going, we wouldn't be on red, but probably we wouldn't be on green, which is a serious issue for the world. Here, I think you don't need to go into detail about the need. We see with global warming increasingly more droughts, floods, hurricanes, and so on, and very frequently and more intensely. We've always had these events, but what we see is that they are becoming more intense and frequent. So it is undisputable that we actually have to do something. We are doing something. The whole world is. The steel industry worldwide, also in Latin America and Brazil, all of us have to do our part. Here, I wanted to show where it comes from the Paris Agreement, and the needs that we humans and the world really need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But I'd like to provide a context of where we are. So I have here total CO2 emissions per region. So we work a lot in defining where the problem is, the priority, and so on and so forth. So this is figures from 2020. It's the 8 top emissions globally. Here we have 60% of the whole emissions worldwide. And total emissions is totals to 47.5 gigatons of CO2 per year in 2020. And you can see that the first one is China, 12.3 gigatons, representing 26% of the CO2 in greenhouse gas emissions worldwide. So there is no global solution that if China does not commit and strongly reduces. Second, the United States, 5.63 gigaton, which is 11% of worldwide global emissions. So if you add the first and second, China plus the United States, it's 26 plus 11, 37% of greenhouse gas emissions are in China and the US. So without the help of these countries, we will never reach the goal that I showed in the first slide. And then we have India, European Union, Russia, Indonesia, and Brazil. Brazil is the seventh most emitting country in the world, and then Japan, and lastly, I included Latin America, that altogether emits 3.9. Then you can see that 3.9 is not little, it's not, and then we will see where it comes from. If you compare to the left, European Union that has done a lot, it's whoever's leading this process worldwide. The European Union has 3% and Latin America as a whole 3.9. So it is not a problem from the others. It's also in Latin America. And this 3.9 represent 8.2% globally. So what's very clear is that from 3.9, almost half of Latin America's emissions come from Brazil. It's 1.5. In Brazil, I have a chart there, a pie chart. So you can see that in Brazil, 60% of emissions in Brazil come from the use of soil and agriculture. So we are in the industry, we're talking about the industry yesterday and today, and the industry in Brazil represents 6%. And of these 6%, 4% is the steel industry. So in Latin America, contributes with 8.2% of the global emissions. And in Latin America, 38% comes from Brazil, 18% from Mexico, and 10% from Argentina. So Brazil, Mexico, and Argentina make up 2/3 of the total emissions in Latin America. So the main message here is there is no way out of this problem if we don't include China, the involvement of China and the US and Latin America, that many people think does not contribute a lot. It's not one of the biggest, but there is participation in work has to be done here. Here, I'd like to show from Latin America 2020, so you can see that this changes a bit compared to Brazil. Brazil made up 60, more or less 65 with the use of the land and agriculture, but here we have the use of the land and agriculture adds up to, let's see, 50%. So Brazil is a bit different from Latin America overall. It's 50% compared to 66% if you only consider Brazil. But in terms of energy, not electric energy, but total energy, it represents 41%, and in Brazil it's 29%. So Brazil has a very good energy generation. Actually, this year, Brazil is reaching 85% of renewable energy generation. So this makes it very clear that agriculture and use of land are also very important in Latin America. You can see that the industry in Latin America represents the emission of 4.4% of the whole of Latin America, and the steel industry were here representing 2.4% all the emissions of greenhouse gases in Latin America. Another important message, okay, the steel industry has to work, and then we are going to work. We will be working to reduce emissions. We have to contribute. But I'd say this, if the steel industry reaches zero, even so, Latin America is going to emit a lot. We have to work, but it's not going to determine the future of emissions in Latin America. Then we continue showing the numbers, but I showed you the numbers because we maybe will start we need the figures. Then I wrote 2000 globally in Latin America, in blue 20, 21, 22. The ton of CO2 and ton of steel. So in 2000, Latin America was smaller, 2021 even smaller as well, 1.6.
And the last one from 2022, 1.91 tons of CO2 per ton of steel against 1.55 from Latin America. So you can see that this is really important data from 2020 to 2022. Latin America was able to reduce 7%. That's a lot. So it was a very significant, important reduction. And this comes from more renewable energy production and more energy efficiency. So we've been working very strongly in Latin America on renewable energies, and we were able to reduce 7% by 2022, which, once again, this is an excellent result. Now, I also considered here, because this account, because the numbers from China sometimes change. So we had an estimate, and the global estimate would be around 2.8 against 1.55 from Latin America. This represents, if we consider this China estimate, this would be 26% less for Latin America than the global average. And if this is not considered, it would be 19%. So once again, I repeat, Latin America we need to continue this strong work on reducing emissions, but we've seen a very significant reduction from 2020 to 2022 by 7%, and we are at either 19 or 26% less than the global average. Well, the main challenges for the global steel industry for decarbonization, in our view, is that first, we need to understand that this is a very difficult task. The first item I have here is not an easy task. And we'll understand why later on, because we still don't have the technology, etc. We know certain things, but we have to develop others. So this is the second item here. Technologies nowadays, we already know some important topics that need to be done, but we are not fully there yet. So another important challenge for us, for the global steel industry, is that we will have to invest a lot of capex, and our operational expenses will increase. So this needs to be very well understood, because we need to invest a lot of capex, and our OPEX is going to go up. This needs to be offset in some way from customers, because otherwise the steel industry will not be able to handle it. We have biomass available in Latin America, especially. We have a lot of it. This is important. We also have natural gas and renewable energies. We'll need to see renewable energy at low cost, and Brazil is truly something that needs to be followed, and we need availability of green hydrogen that should be the actual future. It's the oil of the future, but this needs to be compatible. The costs need to be compatible, otherwise we won't be able to advance in a competitive way. But our view is that to have a sustainable world, the future requires steel. And anywhere you go, if you're in here, if you go to the airport, you'll see steel everywhere. And we strongly believe that decarbonization, or achieving the net zero emission goal for CO2, goes through steel production, because first, constructions, infrastructures will require steel. Electrical cars that we've been discussing here also require steel. We'll need a lot of new technologies for machines and equipment that will also require steel. To have a storage and distribution of energy also requires steel for their constructions. And wind and solar energy production also requires steel. So we know that steel is highly recyclable. And this steel becomes increasingly important in this whole process. So we believe that this is a very important challenge for global steel making, but we do believe that steel is part of the solution for these major challenges. This is our view on how we're going to be working on the challenges to reach the net zero by 2050. So what are the phases here? We're also talking about the 1, 2, 3 scopes. Our view is that technologies in the medium term, let's call this by 2030, we will really need to use and develop renewable sources for energy matrix. It has to move from fossil to renewable. The use of scrap metal will be very important. Natural gas at competitive prices as a product, because gas will be used for the transition. That's why I'm talking about the timeline till 2030. This is a product that will be part of the transition. We also need to develop biomass uses, and in some Latin American countries are very strong in biomass. Brazil is one of these countries, and we believe that by 2030 we'll need to focus on bringing down the emissions by 50%. We'll also need to use DRI and HBI in the electrical furnaces, and that's another goal for 2030. And capturing CO2 to reduce emissions on working on electrical cars, and energy efficiency, like I said. And you can see that the number one and the first and last bullets are something that we've been working very strongly from. Like I showed results from 2020 to 2022, we were able to reduce 7%. So we believe that this is going to be a phased process. So by 2030, we'll need to work on these items here, these action items, and the next phase will be differently, will be done differently. So by 2030, 50% reduction, and by 2050, we'll reach net zero. So this is a drawing, a graphic here from ArcelorMittal. This is how we're working around the world. We face the challenge of leading decarbonization in steelmaking industry in the world. Since we are a leader in this area, it is our duty to lead. So this is a summary of the work we've been doing. And in the group, I'm not going to go into the details because you might think it's very complicated, but after 2030, I said that this is what we're going to do by 2030, but between 2030 to 2050, we believe that we'll have to do some other things. So first of all, what's clear for us is that we do not, at ArcelorMittal, we do not believe that we will need to end the high furnaces. We know that these are the biggest responsible for CO2 emissions, but we strongly believe that this is not going to be end of the high furnaces, as I'm going to show you later on. Oh, we're going to be working on HBI and etc. But we don't believe that this is going to be the end of the high furnaces. This product is called Smart Steel on the left here, together with the Smart Carbon project, and this is. We are certain that this is not going to be. This is going to be the way to go. First, we're going to inject green hydrogen in these blast furnaces. So we're going to be injecting, but this is the second item, to increase the efficiency of these blast furnaces with new equipment, new technologies, and so carbon is the fossil fuel. And how we're going to inject since we're going to inject green hydrogen and increase efficiency, will generate less CO2. And this lower generation of CO2, and we've been working harder for this, to capture CO and CO2, which we're calling the CCU, that's to be reused. We're going to capture this and transform it into ethanol or some other chemicals to emit. And whatever is not reused will create the CCS, which is basically storage of CO2 and the remaining CO2 and CO. So this is basically a simplified version of how ArcelorMittal is working all around the world. Once again, we don't believe that it will be the end of the blast furnaces. It's just going to be a different process, and this is how we see it. And the other one is more steel and DRI production with the electrical furnaces using green hydrogen. This is what we believe. We'll have some different types of furnaces and a different route to produce steel using green hydrogen with the DRIs and electrical furnaces. Because today we have $4 to $5 per kilo. This is the cost maybe $4, $5, $6 per kilogram of hydrogen. And for this to be economically feasible, we need to reach 1.5 US dollars per kilogram of hydrogen. There's a lot to do, but this is from 2030 to 2050. And this is the other path for the other type of furnace. Our vision is just using a different blast furnace, and the other route would be the use of green hydrogen and the electrical furnaces and the arch furnaces. So what we see in terms of action points to accelerate decarbonization of steel making around the world is what we really discussed here at length yesterday. The industrialization of Latin America is extremely important because, of course, when you generate more, when you produce more scraps as well. But it's going to be important to use the electrical furnace. Also, we don't see any way for the steel industry reaching the goals proposed by the government by 2050 without the partnership from the government. The steel companies alone won't be able to reach this. So it's important to have a partnership from the government, and other countries are already doing it. The other point is competitive costs. We know that we have a lot of natural gas in Latin America, in Venezuela, Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil also. But some other countries don't have competitive prices, and we'll need to have that. We also need to create mechanisms to adjust carbon at the borders. We all know that CBAM, which is this adjustment mechanism for carbons at the border, we know that this is about to go into Europe, and then if it goes to the US, China is going to just send us steel. And we see that we have 26% lower emissions than China. So we also believe that Latin America will need to protect itself with a CBAN against steel from countries that have higher emissions than Latin America. We also believe that if we have a carbon market in Brazil, this has been discussed at length at the Congress, and if we have a carbon market with this balance of some paying, some receiving, we need the government to use this money, these funds from the carbon market, to be a lost fund to help companies reach the goals by 2030 and 2050. And lastly, we strongly believe in green hydrogen. We understand that these are the important action items to accelerate Latin America in the decarbonization route. And as I just mentioned, I'm not going to go into the details here because most of you already know this, but this is a very strong incentive. As you know, ArcelorMittal is present in almost all countries across the world, and there is an innovation fund that is very strong, very relevant in Europe. 28 countries in Europe have been investing greatly to help the steel industry to reduce CO2 emissions. We have the IRA in the US, you all know, and in Canada, we also have some new interventions and technologies. So what I mentioned here is that Brazil, Argentina, and Latin America in general will require governments to think about how to take part in this major challenge, which is to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. As we've seen, Latin America has important emissions, but it is 19% lower compared to the average global rate, either 16 or 29% considering China. So we are below. And we see that we have great opportunities. It won't be just the challenge. We do have an opportunity for this new green economy. Latin America, with so many great resources, needs to use this to make Latin America grow. We need to grow not only the industry, but also reduce this inequality, social inequality in Latin America. So if we can take this new green economy and make it something great to help Latin America grow as a region. We also believe we have several opportunities because we have a lot of sunlight, lots of wind in Brazil, Argentina, and Mexico. So there are many opportunities to have totally renewable energy. Here in Brazil this year, we have around 85% of this year's energy from renewable sources.
In many countries in America Latina, as well as Brazil, has the opportunity to making Latin America grow. Argentina, Venezuela, Bolivia, Mexico, and Brazil have a lot of natural gas. We need to develop it even more because natural gas is not the end, but it is the gas of transition up to 2030 for our CO2 emissions. We have green hydrogen. If we have renewable energy, we can produce green hydrogen. That, in our opinion, is going to be the fuel of the future. We have many projects in Latin America. Brazil has shown Uruguay. We saw many projects from green hydrogen, and we have this important opportunity to grow the economy in Latin America. And lastly, biomass. Brazil has a huge potential of biomass, and we have to focus on that as well to make countries grow. And to conclude, one, I've seen Latin America has important emissions. We saw more than 3% of global emissions, but compared to the rest of the world, we're 19% below the world if you don't consider China, if we do 26%. Emissions are important in Latin America, but we reduced 7% in 2 years. It is important, but we are on the right track. More, something else, but as I said, we are going to need the whole steel industry. Of course, we'll need a lot of resources, capex, and we will also have increase in OPEX. And this surely will need a partnership with government. The role of the government will be crucial, and this is what we've seen abroad, as I showed in the United States, Europe, Canada, and so on. The availability of natural gas and competitive costs will be important in the transition to up to 2030, and in the medium term, and the development of green hydrogen and the new blast furnace that I showed that we think is going to be the future, which is going to be CCS and CCU. We had great opportunity in Latin America. And lastly, as I showed, our CO2 generation is important, but we're around 20% less than global. And with all of that I showed here, we have opportunities, very important opportunities of being at the forefront, and not only to reduce CO2, but also make Latin America grow, make the industry grow, so the reduction of these social inequalities that we have. It's a very important challenge for Latin America, but we have a great opportunity. That was it. Thank you.